The first thing Aaron Vance learned about the Viscari was that they did not look at the mountain that was killing them. It rose behind the hive like a second sun gone wrong, pale, ridged, listing slightly to the east where the prevailing wind had been working at it for 100 years. Spent brood cases, the brittle plates of generations, slag from chitin furnaces banked in dark glassy seams, wet rot where the rain found the lower terraces and pulled their juices down into the aquifer the hive still drank from. He could smell it before they marched him through the outer gate. He could smell it on the guards themselves, sour sweet under the dry, papery scent of their bodies, and they did not seem to know it was on them. They had pulled him out of the wreck of the courier skiff 3 days earlier. He had been alone by then. The other two were broken parts in the dust by the time the Viscari hunters came clicking across the ridge. He did not fight them. He had nothing left to fight with except the steel flask in his coat pocket, his sister's flask, with her initials scratched into the cap, and a flask was not a weapon against a thing the size of a horse with mandibles that could shear through reinforced ablative plate. He had let them take him because the alternative was the cold of a planet whose air would not feed him long, and because some old training under his ribs said the longer you stayed alive, the more of a story you had. They marched him on a tether of braided fiber, 4 guards in close formation, their compound eyes cocked toward him in flat amber regard. The hive opened in front of them as they descended the long terraced approach. Domed chambers of secreted resin, ribbed and glossy, fitted into the rock like vertebrae. Lattice walks, the slow drift of drones at their domestic work. A scent song he did not know how to hear yet drifted across the terraces, layered and complicated, the way human cities sound from a hill at evening. 1,000 small businesses braided into one tone. And behind all of it the howdah, reaching higher than the highest chamber dome, casting its long pale shadow across the eastern faces of the hive, so big it was a fact of the sky. He turned his head to look at it as they walked. The guard on his left clicked once, sharp, and tugged the tether to face him forward, as if it were rude to look, as if it were not there to be looked at. They put him in a holding alcove of dim resin-walled stone and left him with a bowl of pale paste that smelled of crushed insect and old water. He did not eat it. He sat with his back to the wall and felt the cold come through his coat and listened to the hive go about its evening above him. After a long while he took the flask out and unscrewed the cap and smelled what was left inside and screwed the cap back on without drinking. There was not much. He was going to need it. The young one came down to him before the second bell. He did not know it was a bell. It was a sound the hive made on a slow, regular pulse, deep, more felt than heard, and he came to understand later that it was the Queen Mother's heart amplified through the resin lattice, broadcast through the chambers so that every drone in every alcove of every terrace knew that she lived, and that the hive lived because she did. The young one was smaller than the guards. Her chitin was paler, almost translucent at the joints, and the plates of her thorax had the chalky bloom of recent molting. Her compound eyes were huge in her face, and they did not have the flat regard of the others. They watched him the way a child watches a thing in a jar that has begun to do something the child did not expect. She came in with a fresh bowl of paste, and set it down and crouched at a distance that he understood after some time was her version of careful. "You will eat," she said. Her voice came partly from her mandibles, which clicked, and partly from a centorgan at the base of her throat that he could only register as a faint sweet pressure in his sinuses. The translation crystal at his collar, the one they had bothered to leave on him, picked out the words in his own language and rendered them flat and small. "You will eat or your inside will collapse, and the Queen Mother will be angry that the specimen failed before she could observe it." "I'm Aaron," he said. She tilted her head. The mandibles ticked, considering. "Aaron," she repeated, "that is a sound, not a name. A name is a scent. It's the only one I have." She crouched lower. She studied him for a long moment in silence. Then she said, "I am Elsie. That is what the translation makes of my scent, My scent is, and she gave a small puff of something through the organ at her throat, a complicated layered sweetness. That. But the translation makes ALC of it, so ALC will do. ALC, he said. She made a soft click he came to recognize as approval. You should eat, Aaron. He ate. It tasted of crushed insect and old water. He kept it down. She sat with him while he ate and afterward and asked him questions a guard would not have asked. How did he see with eyes that small? How did he breathe with no scent organ on his throat? Did he know that his hands had 5 appendages each, and that was an inefficient number? Did he know that he was warm? Did he know that the warmth was leaving him, slow, into the resin floor, and that he ought to sit on something? He took off his coat and folded it and sat on it. She made the approval click again. He asked her at last about the mountain. She did not understand the question. He had to point. He had to point twice, and then she rose and went to the alcove's small slit window and looked out, and she looked back at him with her huge eyes and clicked, puzzled. There is no mountain there, she said. He went and stood beside her and looked out at the howdah, vast and pale and listing. That, he said. That is the heap, she said. That is what was. That is not a mountain. A mountain is rock. The heap is, she paused, hunting the word. The heap is over. He said nothing. You are tired, she said. I will come tomorrow. She went. He sat with his back to the resin wall and watched the slit window darken and felt the howdah out there in the dark, listing toward them. He took the flask out of his coat pocket and held it without opening it for a long time. The Queen Mother received him on the 3rd day. They cleaned him first. They did it without ceremony, with a kind of efficient indignity that he understood was not meant as cruelty. He was a specimen. A specimen was groomed before presentation. They sluiced him with cool secreted fluid and rubbed him down with fibrous pads, and gave him a fresh undertunic of woven nest fiber that itched on his shoulders and smelled faintly of larvae. Then they marched him up the long ascending spiral of the central chamber line, and through 3 sets of resin doors that opened with the slow, patient creak of living tissue, and into the brood court. He had not been prepared. She filled it. That was the first thing. She filled the space the way certain landscapes fill the eye, not by being larger than the eye could take in, but by being so much of what it could take in that nothing else fit. Isvithra, the Queen Mother of the Viscari hive of Threnodiiv. Her body was long and pale and complicated and beautiful in a way that he did not have language for. Her chitin was the white of old ivory shot through with pearl. Her compound eyes were vast, and their facets were not the simple repeating hexagons of the workers, but something more articulate, more various, more attentive. He could feel her looking at him. He had not known until that moment that being looked at was a pressure. He stood at the marked place on the resin floor where they put him, and he kept his hands at his sides, and he did not look down because he had been told once by a man older than him that the trick of being small in front of something large was not to make yourself smaller. He looked up. He met her eyes. She studied him for what felt like a long time. The brood court was full of attendants, drones and tenders, and one old enforcer with cracked thorax plates standing at a respectful distance, and none of them moved. Behind her, in the curved chamber recess at her back, he could see 3 small shapes, pale, soft chitined, curled into the resin folds of the recess like fruit in a bowl, the seedlings, her own, the hive's future. He did not look at them long. She spoke. Her scent came down on him like weather. The translation crystal hissed at his collar, trying to keep up. You are warm. Yes. You are small. Yes. You came down out of the sky in a thing that broke, the hive observed. You walked from the wreck 11 steps, and then you sat down, and you did not stand again until our hunters came. Yes. You did not fight. No. She considered this for a slow time. The drones around her did not move. The old enforcer's mandibles ticked once and went still. What were you? A medic, he said, before then a courier. The translation crystal had to feel for the words. The brood court rustled, very faintly, with the shift of attention. A medic, she said, you heal. Sometimes. You will be kept, she said. You will be observed. The young tender Elsie has expressed interest. You will be assigned to her chamberlain for the duration of your usefulness. When you cease to be useful, you will be processed into the heap. All right, he said. She tilted her great pale head. The facets of her eyes shifted in some pattern he could not read. You do not fear. I'm afraid, he said. I just don't have anywhere to put it. The brood court was silent for a long moment. Then Isvithra made a sound that the translation crystal at his throat rendered, after a pause, as a low, dry word. Interesting. She turned her face back toward her recess, and her 3 small seedlings stirred in the folds of resin, sensing the shift of her attention, and one of them lifted its soft, pale head and looked at him over the curve of her flank with eyes that had not yet learned to be flat. The eyes of a thing that did not know yet what was a person and what was not. Aaron made himself not look. They walked him back down through the chambers. Elsie was waiting at the lower terrace. She fell in beside him as if she had always been beside him. The guards peeled off one by one as they descended, and by the time they reached her chamberlain at the eastern edge, there was only her and him and a long, slow afternoon coming on. She showed him her quarter of the hive, the lattice walk that ran past her work alcove, the small stand of bioluminescent moss blooms she was supposed to be tending, which were not blooming, the seam door of the chamber where she slept. The chamberlain was her brood line, her chamber mother and chamber father and 2 older brood sisters, and a cousin and a great uncle named Vec who was very old, and who tended a row of fungal blooms outside his own alcove, the only blooms still alive on the eastern slope, and barely. The neighbors were named. Osh, the enforcer with the cracked thorax plates, lived 2 seam doors down. Across the lattice walk was the chamberlain of the Heiners, who were old and slow and kept to themselves. Below them, at the very edge of the hive, where the chamber domes ran out and the bare slope began, was the Ver family. Elsie did not want to talk about the Ver. He saw their dwelling on the 3rd evening. It was not a chamber dome. It was a kind of patched tent of stretched chitin fiber held up by salvaged lattice bowls, sagging at the seams, propped against the slope at the edge of the world. There was a small one inside, smaller even than the seedlings he had seen in the brood court, and an older one tending it, and the male of their unit was outside trying to mend a tear in the chitin skin of the tent, with paste from a small clay pot. Why, said Aaron. Elsie did not answer at first. Then she said, their birth pod cracked 20 cycles ago. The chamberlain was deemed unsound. They were put outside the proper rings. And no one will let them in. It is not done. He stood and watched the vermeil work on the tent in the failing light. The wind was rising. It was the wind that came down off the Halda every evening at this hour, dry and thin and full of the powdered grit of old chitin. The vermeil turned his face into it and worked without stopping. What happens to them? They live there. For how long? Elsie looked at him. Her huge eyes were dark in the dusk, until they do not. He learned to read the hive by the small sounds. The first bell at dawn, the second bell at midday, the third at evening. The deep-felt pulse of the Queen Mother's heart underneath them all, slow and unfailing, the only metronome that mattered. The chamber songs at dusk, when each chamberlain sang its scent song into the lattice for the others to hear, a kind of nightly accounting, a calling out across the dark to say we are still here, we are still us. He came to recognize the scent song of Elsie's chamberlain. He came to recognize old Vex, thin and reedy and apologetic. The verse was almost nothing, a small sound from outside, easy to pretend you did not hear. The hive went about its business while the Halda came on. It did not move much, not in a day, not in a week, But he watched the line of it against the morning light, and he saw where it pressed against the eastern lattice walk now, where it had not last week. He saw the wet rot at the base of the Heiner's chamber dome where the seepage came down through the resin. He saw the dark seam in the aquifer channel where the bad water was coming in. He saw the dead moss blooms in Ailsea's work alcove. He saw, at the edges of every chamber line, the small, slow tightening of things. No one looked. That was the part that broke him those first weeks, not the captivity. He had taught himself captivity in worse rooms. It was the not looking. He would stand on the lattice walk in the morning and look at the Halda, and Viscari would pass him at their work, and he would watch their faces, the orientation of their compound eyes, the angle of their thoraxes, and they would walk past him with the Halda directly behind him, filling half the sky, and their eyes would not move to it. Not once. Not by accident. As if it had been edited out of what their nervous systems consented to register. He asked old Vec about it. Vec was the only one who would answer. He was tending his fungal blooms when Aaron came up the lattice walk to him, the small clay pots arranged in 3 careful rows along the resin shelf outside his alcove, each pot with its bloom in it, each bloom paler than it should have been, each bloom going. Vec had a small misting bulb in his foreclaw, and he was misting them one by one and singing to them, very quietly, in a scent song the translation crystal at Aaron's collar could not parse, that came through only as a low, sad pressure in his sinuses. "Old one," said Aaron. Vec looked up. His eyes were milky at the edges. He was old enough that his chitin had gone gray-brown along the seams. "The warm one," said Vec. Sit there. Do not knock the 3rd pot, it is dying and I am pretending it is not." Aaron sat. "They don't look at it," he said. Vec did not ask what. "No," said Vec, "they do not." "Why?" The old Viscari misted his 3rd pot very gently. He set the bulb down. He turned to Aaron with the slow turning of his whole upper thorax, because his neck joint did not move well anymore. "Because if they looked at it," said Vec, "they would have to do something about it. And if they did something about it, they would have to admit that it was something. And if they admitted it was something, they would have to admit that it had been something for a long time. And if they admitted that, they would have to admit that all their chamber mothers and chamber fathers, and their chamber mothers, and so on back to the founding, had been making it. And that is too many to admit, so they do not look." "What about the Queen?" Vec made a small soft sound that the translation crystal rendered as a sigh. "The Queen looks at her seedlings." "Only her seedlings." "It is enough work for one queen." Aaron sat with that for a while. The wind off the Halda came down the lattice walk and rattled the dead leaves of Vec's fungal blooms, and a powder of pale grit came with it, and it settled on Vec's gray chitin and on Aaron's hands, and on the 3rd pot that Vec was pretending was not dying. "Old one," said Aaron. "Oh, what was here before the heap?" Vec's milky eyes turned to him. They were a long time finding focus. "A river," said Vec, "and blooms, real ones, not these." "What color?" The old one's mandibles ticked. He did not have a color word the crystal could find. He gestured, very small, with one foreclaw, and the gesture meant, "A color you have not seen." Aaron nodded. He sat with Vec until the 3rd bell. He began to teach himself the language. Not the formal language. The formal language was scent and click, and he did not have the organs for either, but the way the hive moved. He learned the lattice walks the way a man learns a city. He learned which seam doors were never closed and which were never open. He learned the times of day when the eastern terrace caught the sun and when it did not. He learned that the brood tenders moved in 4s and the enforcers in 2s and the resin mothers always alone. He learned that no Viscari ever pointed because pointing was a thing you did with a finger, and they did not have fingers. They oriented. Their whole bodies turned. You could read a hive's attention from 100 paces by watching the orientation of the thoraxes on a lattice walk, the way a flock of birds turns in air. He learned, too, what he was. He was a thing the hive had decided to allow. He was a small, warm anomaly tolerated for the duration of his interest. The drones at their work would track him with their compound eyes as he passed, not openly, but with a small, constant attention, the way you watch a stranger in your house. They never spoke to him. Elsie spoke to him. Old Vex spoke to him. The Vermeil had once, across the slope, raised a foreclaw in his direction in something that might have been greeting and might have been warning. No one else. He was furniture that had been allowed to walk around. He kept a small ritual. Every morning before the first bell, he took the flask out of his coat pocket and held it without opening it for the time it took to count 30 breaths. He did not drink. He had not drunk since the day they brought him in. He held the flask and he counted the breaths and he put it back in the pocket, and then he went out into the lattice walks and he watched the orientation of the thoraxes and he listened to the bells and he taught himself the city. He had been a medic before he had been a courier, before he had been a great many things. The hive did not know about any of them. The hive had decided he was a warm, small, inefficient thing, and the hive's decisions, he was learning, were the kind of decisions that did not get revisited. Osh killed the gravid one in the 11th week. Aaron did not see it. He heard about it from Elsie in fragments because she did not want to tell him and he made her tell him. The gravid one was a young chamber mother from 2 chamber lines over. She was carrying a brood clutch of 7. She had said something to Osh about his post at the seam door. Something small. A remark about how the seam door had not been cleaned this week, and the lattice walk was suffering for it. And Osh, who was self-appointed enforcer of the Eastern Terraces and who took his appointment very seriously, and who had been drinking the bad water for a long time without admitting it, had reached out with one foreclaw and broken her thorax open at the seam. She died on the lattice walk in front of her own seam door. The brood clutch died with her. Aaron learned about it because there was a smell in the chamber line for 2 days, a sweet, rotten smell that no one mentioned. He asked Elsie. She would not answer. He asked again. She told him in pieces. "What did the hive do?" he said. "The hive? What did the hive do, Elsie?" She looked at her foreclaws. "The hive cleaned the lattice walk," she said. "And Osh? Osh is still at his post. And the chamber line of the mother. They are in mourning. And no one. It is not done, Aaron." He stood up. He walked out of the chamber. He walked the length of the lattice walk to the seam door where Osh stood, and Osh's compound eyes tracked him as he came, and Aaron stopped at the marked distance and stood and looked at the enforcer for a long time without speaking. Osh's cracked thorax plates were dusted pale with halde grit. His mandibles worked, slow, considering. He was bigger than Aaron by half again. He could have broken Aaron the way he had broken the chamber mother, and there would have been no consequence anyone would have named. Aaron did not move. After a long time, Osh's compound eyes shifted to the side, looking past him at nothing, and Osh made a small dismissive click, and Aaron understood, by the smallness of the click, that Osh was the kind of creature that needed to be looked at by something that was not afraid of him. Aaron turned and walked back to Elsie's chamber line. He did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the resin wall and took out his sister's flask and unscrewed the cap and looked at the small bright thumb of liquid at the bottom. He did not drink it. He screwed the cap back on. He held the flask in both hands until the first bell. The bonding came in the 17th week. It was Elsie's chamber mother who decided it. Aaron had become a problem the chamber line did not know how to hold. A specimen kept too long becomes furniture, and furniture must belong to someone. The chamber mother's solution was a bonding ceremony, the formal incorporation of the warm specimen into the chamber line through the only ritual the line possessed for taking in something new. It would be done with Elsie because Elsie had expressed interest in their language for it, and because Elsie was unmated. He understood when Elsie explained it to him that she did not entirely understand it either. Viscari bondings were not what humans meant by the word. They were not reproductive. The queen was the only reproducing thing in the hive. They were a kind of formal acknowledgement that two scent lines had agreed to share certain seam doors and certain rituals and certain sicknesses. "It is so they can call you of us," said Elsie. "It is so they do not have to call you specimen. It is a kindness." "Is it what you want?" She looked at him for a long time. Her huge eyes were dark in the alcove light. "I do not know what I want," she said. "I know that when I come down the lattice walk in the morning, I am glad if you are at the seam door." "All right," he said. The ceremony was held in the chambermother's alcove on the day of the high bell. The whole chamber line was there. Even old Vec came up from his row of dying blooms, walking very slow, carrying in one foreclaw a single small pale fungal flower he had managed to coax out of the last living pot, which he meant to gift to them at the end of the rite. The chamber mother had prepared scent cords. The chamber father had prepared the resin vessel of formal paste. The cousins sang. The brood sisters arranged the lattice. Aaron stood where they put him, and Elsie stood where they put her, and the chamber mother began the long chant that bound a scent line to a scent line, and the high bell pulsed underneath them all, slow, the heart of the queen. The fire began at the rear of the chamber. He never knew exactly how. The chamber father was old. The resin lamp was old. The chamber mother had insisted on a full lighting for the rite. Something failed at the back of the alcove, in the small recess where the brood records were kept, the scrolls of preserved scent impressions that were the chamber line's memory of itself, the deep archive of who had been born and who had bonded and who had died for 9 generations. The recess took the flame first because the scrolls were dry. By the time anyone noticed, the rear wall of the alcove was alight. The chamber mother screamed and ran for the scrolls. The chamber father went after her. The chamber line scattered. The chamber father got her halfway out. The chamber mother twisted free of him with a strength none of them had known she had and went back for the last scroll, the eldest scroll, the one with her own birth scent on it, and the rear of the alcove came down on her in a soft thudding fall of burning resin, and she did not come out. The chamber father stood in the seam door and watched the place she had been, and made a sound that was not a word in any language, and his centorgan ruptured in his throat from the pure overpressure of grief, and he went down on his knees in the lattice walk, and he was dead before the chamber sisters reached him. Old Vec stood with the small pale fungal flower in his foreclaw and watched, and did not move, and did not speak. Aaron got Elsie out of the smoke. He carried her halfway down the lattice walk in his arms. She was lighter than a human child of 9, and set her down at the seam door of her own alcove, and held her while the chamber line collapsed behind them, the smoke rolling out across the lattice walk, the hive bells beginning to ring out of order, the slow felt pulse of the queen underneath it all going on and on. He did not sleep. He sat with Elsie in her alcove, and she did not speak, and he did not speak, and outside the wind came down off the howdah and brought its grit and rattled the seam doors, and the chamber line of Elsie was over. The howdah took the ver 3 nights later. It had been coming for them. The howdah shifted in slow, long shudders, the way a sand pile slumps when its angle exceeds itself, and it had been slumping eastward all season, and the ver were at the eastern edge in their patched chitin tent, and there came a night when the wind off the heap rose to a long high whine, and the chitin skin of the ver's tent began to tear at its sutured seams. And the ver male went out with his clay pot of paste to try to mend it, and the wind took the pot out of his foreclaw and rolled it down the slope, and the older female came out, and the small one came out, and they stood in the wind with the heap moving above them, and they made a decision. They climbed. Aaron saw them go. He was on the lattice walk because he could not sleep any more, because sleep had become a thing other people did, and he saw their 3 small shapes start up the lower flank of the howdah in the dark with the high wind tearing at them, and he understood what they were trying to do. The vermale had reasoned it out, or maybe he had only run out of reasons. The slope of the howdah led, eventually, to a summit, and the summit had a far side, and the far side, by the geometry of any slope, had to go down. And down was elsewhere, down was not here. Aaron ran along the lattice walk to the seam door of the eastern stair, and he went out into the dust wind and started up after them. He did not know what he meant to do. He had no rope. He had no plan. He had the flask in his coat pocket, and a translation crystal at his collar, and a small hard certainty in his chest that he could not let the Ver go up that slope alone. Elsie caught him at the foot of the slope. She must have followed him from the chamber. No, she said. She had her foreclaws on his arms. Aaron, no. They'll die. They are already outside. That isn't a... Aaron, the heap moves. You go up the heap moves. You cannot go up the heap. The Ver, no. They are not going up the heap to live. They are going up the heap because they have decided to. He looked at her. He looked up the slope where the three small shapes were laboring against the wind. The male first, and then the female with the small one on her back, climbing in the long, slow scuttle of viscari on broken ground. They were a third of the way up the lower terrace. The Halda shrugged. It was not a large movement. It was a small, slow internal settling, the way a sleeper turns in a deep sleep, and it began somewhere up near the second terrace and traveled down through the body of the heap in a long, muffled cascade, and it reached the Ver family on the lower flank, and it took them. There was no sound. The wind ate the sound. He saw the small one slip first off the female's back, and the female reach for it, and then the female was gone, and then the male, and then there was only the slope, still moving, slow, settling, finding its new angle, indifferent. He stood at the foot of it with Elsie's foreclaws on his arms, and he did not move for a long time. She was the one who turned him around eventually. She walked him back inside. She put him in her alcove, and she stayed with him through the rest of the night and into the morning, and she did not speak, and the hive went on around them, and the queen's heart went on, slow and unfailing, underneath them all. Old Vec killed his fish next. That was not the right word for it. They were not fish. They were a small, soft-bodied animal that Vec caught in the slow pond at the lower lip of the chamber line, in a small enclosed water fold he was very proud of, where he had spent a great many cycles cultivating what he believed to be a clean runoff. He had not believed for many years that the slow pond was contaminated. He had drunk from it himself. He gave the small, soft-bodied animals as gifts to chamberlines on important days. He gave them to the Heiners on the day after the Ver were taken. He did it as a kindness. The Heiners were old, and they had been agitated by what had happened on the slope, and Vec thought a small kindness was called for. He brought them a paste made from the small, soft-bodied animals of his slow pond, and he set it down at their seam door, and he made the small, respectful click of an old one giving a gift to old ones, and the Heiners took the paste, and they ate it. And by the second bell of the next day they were both dead. It was not a violent death. It was the slow death of something that had eaten what it should not have eaten. The chamber line of the Heiners was small and old, and the news traveled slow, and by the time Vec understood what his hands had done, the Heiners had been carried out for processing, and the hive had begun its slow, disinterested work of moving on. Aaron went up the lattice walk to Vec's alcove on the evening of the fourth day. The old one was sitting on the resin shelf where his fungal blooms had been. The blooms were all dead now. The small clay pots were arranged in their 3 careful rows along the shelf, and every pot had a black soft thing in it where a bloom had been, and Vec was sitting among them with his foreclaws folded in his lap and his milky eyes on nothing. "Old one," said Aaron. "The warm one. It wasn't your fault." Vec's milky eyes turned to him slowly. He did not answer. "You didn't know," said Aaron. "That is the point," said Vec. "I did not know. That is what I have spent my long life on, not knowing." Aaron did not have a thing to say to that. "You and the small one," said Vec. "Elsie, you will go." "Go where?" "Anywhere, down the western terraces. Out beyond the lower seam doors, through the brood rings, up the heap if you must, you will go." "Old one." "Tell her," said Vec. When you go, come to me first. I will give you a bloom for the road, a small flower from my garden. It is the custom, to go with a flower in the hand. I have not been able to do the custom for a long time. I would like to do the custom once before. There are no blooms, Vec. The old one did not answer. He sat with his foreclaws in his lap and his milky eyes on nothing, and Aaron left him there. He went to Vec in the morning before the first bell. He had spent the night with Elsie and they had talked very quietly in her alcove. They had not talked about whether they would go. They had talked about how. The eastern slope was the Halda and the Halda was death. The western terraces ended in the long drop of the canyon. The southern broodrings were under the Queen's direct guard. North was the way the hunters had brought him, and north was a long cold walk to nothing, and the hive's hunters could run it in a third of the time it would take him on his small, inefficient appendages. The heap, he said. Aaron, it has a far side. It moves. It moves slow. The ver moved fast, we move slow. Aaron, we start before first bell. We climb in the dark. We are over the lip before the second bell. We are down the far side before the hive knows we are gone. Aaron, the heap is dust. It is loose. It will not hold you. Then I'll crawl. She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight. Her huge eyes were dark. I will come, she said. He went to Vec before the first bell. He found the old one's alcove already cold. The small clay pots were arranged in their 3 careful rows along the resin shelf, and old Vec was hanging from the lattice of his moss-bloom frame by his own breath cord, which was the long fibrous trachea that Viscari could extrude from their thorax and extremity, and which served them for both song and suffocation. He had used his own song to end himself. He had done it neatly and with care. There was a small clay pot at his feet, empty, with a thin black smear in it of what had been the last living bloom in his garden, which he had cut at last to give to Aaron for the road, and which had died in his foreclaw before he could hand it over, and which had been the thing that finally broke him. Aaron stood in the alcove a long time. He took the empty pot. He went down the lattice walk to Elsie, and he did not tell her about Vec yet. He told her they were going. They were going now. They were halfway up the lower terrace of the Halda when the centaur came from the brood court. It came up through the resin lattice of the hive and out across the dark slope and into the wind, and it was so large that the air around them seemed to flex with it, and Elsie stopped climbing and turned her face back toward the hive, and her huge eyes went round. Is Vithra, she said. What? The Queen Mother is. What is she saying? Elsie listened. The centaur came again. The hive bells were beginning to ring out of pattern below them, scattered and panicked, the way bells ring when no one is in charge of ringing them. Her seedlings, said Elsie, her seedlings are gone. What do you mean gone? Gone from the brood recess, vanished. The heap shifted in the night. The eastern face of the brood recess opened to the heap. The seedlings, they would have wandered. They are small. They are warm. They would have wandered into the warm of the heap because the resin had gone cold. How many? All 3. Aaron stood on the slope of the Halda with his foreclaw, no, his hand, his small, inefficient 5-fingered hand, gripping the broken edge of a chitin plate the size of a wagon wheel. He looked down at the hive below them, the bells, the scattered scent songs, the single vast centaur coming up through the resin lattice from the brood court. He looked up the slope. He looked at the way the Halda had shifted in the night. A long fresh seam ran down the eastern face above them, a place where the heap had cracked open and shed downward, a place where small, warm, wandering things might have gone in and not come out. Elsie. Aaron, no. Aaron, we have to go. The hunters will be coming. She will blame the warm one. She will come for you herself. Elsie, the seam, up there to the left of where we are. Aaron, wait for me. He went sideways across the slope before she could stop him. He went on his hands and knees because the slope would not hold him upright. He went into the fresh seam in the heap where it had shed open in the night, and the air inside the seam was sour-sweet and warm with the residual heat of recent collapse, and he went in calling very softly, the kind of call you used for a frightened animal or a frightened child, in a voice he had not used in a very long time. He found them in a pocket of fallen chitin 20 paces in. 3 small pale shapes curled together against the cold of the deep heap. Their soft chitin was filmed with halde grit. One of them had a small cut along the curve of its thorax, where a chitin plate had caught it on the way down. They were alive. They were breathing slow, shallow breaths, and they had pressed themselves against each other for the warmth that was not in the heap. And one of them lifted its head when he came near, and its eyes were the eyes that had looked at him over Isvithra's flank in the brood court, the eyes of a thing that had not yet learned what was a person and what was not. He knelt down in the pocket of fallen chitin, and he opened his coat. He gathered them, very careful. They were lighter than he had expected and warmer than he had expected. He laid them against his chest one by one, inside the coat, where the heat of his body was, and he buttoned the coat closed over them. The one with the cut on its thorax pressed its small face into the hollow of his throat and made a small high click. The other 2 pressed against his ribs and went quiet. He started back out of the seam. Elsie was waiting at the lip. She saw him come out with his coat full of small breathing weight, and her huge dark eyes went round and her mandibles ticked, fast, panicked. "Aaron, Aaron, what are you?" "Climb." "Aaron." "Elsie, climb up now." She climbed. He climbed after her, slow, both hands on the heap because he could not use the front of his body. The front of his body was occupied. He climbed with his coat full of seedlings, and he could feel them breathing against his ribs, and he could feel the smallest one trembling under his collarbone, and he hummed, very low, because the smallest one was trembling and there was nothing else he had to give it. He hummed a tune his grandmother had hummed to him. It was not a tune with words. It was a long, low, rocking tune in a minor key that she had hummed when he was very small and could not sleep, and which he had not thought of in 20 years, and which came up out of him now in the dust wind on the eastern face of the halde of Threnodiiv, as if it had been waiting in him all along. The smallest one stopped trembling. He thought about her while he climbed. He had not thought about her in a long time. She had been a small woman with hard hands who had grown up on a cold coast on a planet he had not seen in 15 years. She had hummed the tune over a wooden cradle she had built herself out of driftwood and salvage. She had hummed it over him and then over his sister and then over his sister's children. And when she died, she had been humming it under her breath in a clean white bed that smelled of antiseptic, and she had not known she was humming it. And he had stood at the foot of the bed and listened, and that was the last time he had heard it before now. He climbed. The slope was loose. His boots slid. He went on his knees again, and the largest seedling shifted against his sternum, and he stopped and braced and waited until it settled and started up again. The centaur came up the slope behind them, before they were halfway to the lip. He did not need Elsie to translate. He heard it in his bones. Isvithra was coming. She had come out of the brood court, and she had come up through the chambers, and she had come out onto the eastern slope, and she was climbing the halde herself, the largest body in the hive, the queen mother in the full extremity of her grief and her fury, and her centaur came up the slope ahead of her like weather. The translation crystal at his collar tried to keep up. It gave him pieces. The warm one. The thief. The small one, my seedlings, my seedlings. I will take him apart in pieces, I will scatter him through the heap, I will. Aaron, said Elsie. Aaron, we are not going to make it. Climb. Aaron. Climb, Elsie. They climbed. The slope grew steeper. The halde was sloughing under them now, small avalanches of dust and broken chitin running down past their feet, the heap shifting in long muffled cascades as it took notice of them. He climbed on his knees in one hand, and he held his coat closed with the other hand. The smallest one had begun to sleep. He could feel it sleeping. Its small breath was warm at his throat, and he hummed, and it slept against his collarbone, and the other two, sensing it, also slept. The lip of the howdah was 20 paces above them when Isvithra came over the slope behind them. He turned, he had to. He could not climb the last 20 paces with her behind him. He would die with his back to her, and that was not the way to die with 3 small sleeping things against your chest. He turned. He sat down on the slope, and he braced his back against a slab of dead chitin, and he put both hands over the front of his coat, and he waited. She came up the slope in a long, terrible scuttle. She was bigger than anything had any right to be on a slope like that. Her pale chitin was filmed with howdah grit. The facets of her vast compound eyes were full of a light he did not have a word for. The centaur around her was so dense it was almost visible, a shimmer in the air, and the dust on the slope moved with it. She came up the last 10 paces in a rush. She reared up over him. The whole sky was her foreclaws spread. The translation crystal at his collar hissed and could not keep up. He opened his coat. He did not say anything. He did not have anything to say. He opened his coat and he held it open with both hands, and he leaned back against the slab of chitin so that she could see, clearly, what was on his chest. 3 small pale shapes, curled together, breathing slow. The smallest one with its face in the hollow of his throat, asleep. The middle one with its small claw curled around the edge of his undertunic, asleep. The largest one with its head on the crown of his sternum, asleep. The cut on its thorax had stopped bleeding. They were filmed with howdah grit, and they were warm, and they were alive, and they were asleep on a human's chest, because the heap had been cold, and his body had not been. Isvithra stopped. She stopped the way a wave stops when it hits a sea wall. She did not slow, she stopped. The whole vast forward motion of her arrested in one beat, and the centaur around her arrested with it, and the air on the slope went suddenly very quiet, and the wind off the howdah whined, distant, and the smallest seedling at his throat made a small sleeping click and pressed closer. She did not lower her foreclaws right away. They stayed where they were, spread above him, capable of taking him apart in pieces. He looked up at her, he did not look away. He had been told once by a man older than him that the trick of being small in front of something large was not to make yourself smaller. He kept his hands on the open edges of the coat. He kept the seedlings visible. He did not move. The hum was still going. He had not noticed. The long, low rocking tune in a minor key. He had not stopped humming. He stopped now, embarrassed, and the middle seedling stirred against his ribs, and he started humming again, quieter, and the seedling settled. Isvithra's foreclaws came down, slow. She lowered her great pale head until her vast compound eyes were level with his, and she looked at him, and she looked at her seedlings on his chest, and she looked back at him. Her scent came down on him. The translation crystal at his collar caught it. Why? It was not a question that had a roar in it anymore. It was a question that had nothing in it. The crystal rendered it small. He thought about it. He thought about a number of answers. He thought about saying because they were small. He thought about saying because the heap was cold. He thought about saying because no one else was going to. He thought about the long line of things going back that had made him a person who carried what could not carry itself. Where I come from, he said, you carry what cannot carry itself. You do not ask whose it is. The translation crystal at his collar hissed and worked. It rendered what it could into scent. He could not tell from her whether it had gotten it right. She did not speak for a long time. The smallest seedling at his throat woke up. It lifted its small head. It saw its mother. It made a small click. It did not panic. It put its head back down on Aaron's collarbone and went back to sleep because it was warm where it was and it was tired and the cold of the heap was far away. Something moved in Isvithra's face. That was not a thing he had a word for. She lowered her foreclaws the rest of the way and she folded them. She lowered her great pale head until her mandibles were near her own seedlings, and she made a long, slow scent call. the call of a brood mother to her brood, soft, particular. A sound the translation crystal did not render because it was not language but the thing language was made out of. The middle seedling stirred against his ribs and made a small sleeping click in answer. The largest one shifted its head. The smallest one did not wake, but its small body relaxed in a way he had not known it had been tense. Isvithra reached, very careful with one foreclaw. She did not take them yet. She touched the largest one only on the curve of its thorax where the cut had stopped bleeding, and she made the soft particular call again. Isvithra, said Aaron. He had not used her name before. He used it now because it seemed to be the moment for it. I'll give them to you. You don't have to take them. I'll give them. She looked at him. One at a time, he said, so they do not wake. He took the largest one first. He cradled the small soft body of it in both hands and he passed it across to her, and she received it in the curve of one foreclaw with a care he had not known she was capable of. The seedling did not wake. It went on sleeping in its mother's foreclaw the way it had been sleeping on his chest. He took the middle one next. He passed it across. She received it. He took the smallest one last. The smallest one woke when he lifted it off his throat. It made a small high click of protest. It did not want to leave the warmth of the human's throat. He hushed it. He hummed the long, low rocking tune again and the smallest one settled, and he passed it across, and Isvithra received it, and the smallest one pressed its face into the curve of her foreclaw, the way it had pressed its face into the hollow of his throat, and it went back to sleep. She held them all three for a long moment in the curve of her foreclaws. Then she lifted her great pale head, and she looked at Aaron on the slope of the halda of her own dying hive, and she said one word. Go. Isvithra. Go up over. The far side of the heap goes down to a river, a real river. There were blooms there once. The hive will not follow you. I will not let it follow you. Go. The hive, she said, is over. The heap is what was. The hive did not look at the heap. Now the heap is looking at the hive. There is nothing for you here, warm one. Go. Elsie had come down the slope to stand beside him. He had not noticed. She had her foreclaws folded against her thorax. Her huge dark eyes were on Isvithra. She was very small in front of the Queen Mother. She was very small in front of any of it. Isvithra's vast compound eyes turned to her. The small tender, said Isvithra. The one who would not look at the heap either and now looks. Go with him. Your chamber line is over. Your scent line is over. Take a new one. Make it small. Make it warm. Elsie made a small click that was not a word. Isvithra lifted her great pale head a final time, and she looked out across the dark slope of the halda, across the long pale listing body of the heap her hive had spent 100 years not looking at, and she made a sound that was not a roar and not a song. It was something between. The translation crystal at Aaron's collar did not try to render it. He thought it was probably the first time she had looked at it. She turned. She started down the slope, slow, careful, the three small sleeping shapes in the curve of her foreclaws. She did not look back. Aaron and Elsie climbed the last 20 paces to the lip of the halda in the gray of a coming dawn. The wind at the top was thinner. The dust was less. He stood at the lip and he looked back once at the hive below, at the bells beginning to ring in scattered patterns, at the chambers, at the slow felt pulse of Isvithra's heart still going underneath it all. And then he turned, and he and Elsie went over the lip, and they started down the far side. The far side went down to a river. It was a long descent and it took them most of the day. The slope on the far side was kinder than the slope on the near side, because it had had 100 years longer to settle, and at the bottom of it the air changed. It was not the air of the hive. It was not the air of the heap. It was the air of somewhere that had not yet been broken. The river ran clean over pale stones. The light off the water was the light off water that has not been poisoned. He sat down on the bank. Elsie sat down beside him. He took the empty clay pot out of his coat pocket, the small clay pot from Vex's alcove, the one with the thin black smear in the bottom of it, and he set it on the stone of the bank between them, and he took his sister's flask out of the other pocket and unscrewed the cap, and looked at the small bright thumb of liquid still inside, and he tilted the flask carefully and let 2 drops fall into the empty clay pot. He didn't know if anything would grow. He set the flask down. He looked up the river. There was light coming off the water, and there was a long, unbroken plain on the far bank, and the wind off it was clean. Elsie put her small foreclaw on the back of his hand. He didn't move it. He started humming again. He didn't notice that he had. The long, low, rocking tune in a minor key. His grandmother's tune. He hummed it into the morning, and the river ran past them clean over the pale stones, and behind them, over the lip of the Halda, the hive went on into its slow, long settling, and somewhere in the deep brood court of it, the Queen Mother held her 3 sleeping seedlings in the curve of her foreclaws and looked, finally, at what she had been made out of. The seedlings slept. They had slept on a human's chest. They would remember the warmth of it as long as there were Viscari to remember anything at all.